It's not every day you see a TV segment go off the rails this spectacularly. Piers Morgan just hosted a panel on his show featuring a liberal activist named James Barr, the former collegiate swimmer Riley Gaines, and the conservative YouTuber Brandon Tatum. When the conversation turned to the subject of allowing transgender athletes to compete in women's sports, well, all hell broke loose.
Riley, I want to ask you a question, because a lot of this is to do with sport and how you feel it's unfair because you're up against people with a bigger body, right? So do you think it's unfair that someone who's taller than you or has more strength than you can be in the same team? Is that the argument we're making here? Is that what's unfair?
I think it's to do with the chromosomes, but I'll let Riley answer that.
The conclusion you're drawing, let's look at this for what it is. A man, on average, you take any sport, you take track and field, you take swimming. Swimming is the sport I played, let's look at swimming. Across the field consistently, if you look at the world record against the men on the men's side versus the world record on the women's side, consistently that athletic performance gap is 10 to 12%. Someone being a few inches taller than me, it does not make up for that 10 to 12% performance gap we're talking about by having a man competing against a woman. Of course, there are natural advantages that people possess, but what we're talking about specifically here is beyond comparison to what the conclusion you're drawing right now.
The conclusion I'm drawing is that we should just get rid of gender altogether, and we should have sports based on body metrics, because then
so you would like to have the Olympics. So just to be clear, the Olympic Games, you'd have gender neutral.
Yes, I would, because the only reason, Riley, surely you agree, the only reason women's sport exists is because men were gatekeeping sport for so long, and then finally said, you know what, fine, have your own. But really, if we just remove
how many biological women?
If we remove gender from sports, please let me finish my point, then we won't have this issue. Safety won't be an issue.
I'm
we
sorry.
Can make sure that everyone has a fair chance.
That is so
competing
James,
together.
that is so spectacularly ill-informed and dumb.
Well, is it, Riley?
Wait,
if you have a gender-neutral Olympics, no biological women would win a gold medal.
Let me just add a point here. Are you saying that we should get rid of men and women's sports altogether?
Similar body types, body metrics, bone index.
That makes no sense. You clearly have never played sports before.
Are you saying that we should get rid of sporting categories altogether and have just one big pool?
No, I'm saying people should compete against people that have a similar body type so that it's fairer.
That makes no sense.
There's a lot to unpack here. But first, I'm Brad Palumbo, and welcome back to Mediaite, your home for commentary and coverage on the intersection of media and politics. So first, I want to touch on this notion put out there by James Barr in this clip that we ought to just get rid of sex segregation in sports and instead have athletes compete by their body type, whatever that means. That's ridiculous. Males and females, even if they're the same height or the same weight, they still have very different bodies, and that manifests itself in a bunch of ways that impact sports. And ironically enough, coming from somebody who calls himself a feminist, this is a radically anti-woman position to take. As Piers Morgan rightly points out, if you had open sex categories for something like Olympic basketball or even Division I college sports for something like basketball, well, that would most likely mean that 0 women get to compete at that level or get access to those opportunities. How is that a progressive vision for women? So men and women's sports are here to stay. We then have this question, which has some degree of nuance and complexity, of how to handle the relatively rare but still significant instances where you have transgender athletes who want to compete in high-level sports. Riley Gaines, who was on this panel, is famous precisely because, as a collegiate swimmer, she was forced to both compete against and share a locker room with Leah Thomas, a transgender woman born biologically male who competed in collegiate swimming. Her perspective was represented, but unfortunately, any sort of moderate or nuanced voice was completely absent from this panel, other than perhaps Piers himself. On one hand, you had James Barr, who seems to have fully embraced every possible pie-in-the-sky progressive notion about gender under the sun. And on the other hand, you had panelists like Riley Gaines and like Brandon Tatum, who seem to entirely reject the idea of transgender people, calling transgender women he, and referring to them as males and men. There really was no representation of the moderate perspective that I think many Americans hold. In this perspective, we should simply let transgender adults live however will make them happiest and accommodate them within reason. But we still shouldn't ignore the basic biological realities that still do make sex segregation in sports both necessary for fairness and for safety. Even that, though, is still kind of different different from the maximalist anti-trans position in this debate, because under their view, they think you should just have to compete according to the sex that's on your birth certificate, no nuance, as simple as that. However, I'm personally totally fine with allowing transgender men who are born biologically female to compete in men's sports, because they're only putting themselves at a disadvantage. But I do think it's important that for women's equality, opportunity, and fairness, that women's sports be segregated to include only people who were born biologically female. And that's not a bigoted or unduly discriminatory position to hold. Anyway, this debate quickly gets so toxic whenever it comes up, but I really do think that there's a reasonable middle ground most Americans could agree on. But that middle ground too often gets overlooked in the media's debates, because pitting extremes against each other makes for more dramatic TV. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for joining me, and please do let me know what you thought of this segment in the comments below, and do consider subscribing and sticking around, and maybe even turning on those bell notifications. Now don't forget to hit the like button, and with that, I'll see you all in the next video.